Right, let's make a start then. Let me welcome you all to this virtual book launch of The Social Brain, The Psychology of Successful Groups. My name's Sue Dopson. I'm a professor at the Business School in Leadership Studies, and also have the great privilege of being academic director for the Strategic Leadership Programme, which many of these ideas I know have come from that we're talking about today. It's my pleasure to chair the session and facilitate the discussion between the panel and our audience today. Before I introduce the speakers, let me say a few words of introduction. I promise you that I've read the book, not from cover to cover, but I've certainly read it. And what I found fascinating was its focus on our inherited biology and how that impacts leadership work. This point about, as humans, we're designed to cope with small scale world, and we wonder why we struggle in larger organizational settings. Now, we know that leadership work is changing, and in the Oxford Strategic Leadership Programme that's so dear to our hearts on this call, we talk about leading in a swamp where it feels like most of leadership work is dealing with emotions, uncertainty, relationships. And we know the idea of leaders having the answers is over. There is much change, but yet there are some things in the way that human beings behave that are unchanging. And this book explores that with real skill and delicacy. The book, cleverly for me, brings the science of our inherited biology together with the practice and politics of organizational life. And crucially, the book advocates leaders doing less, but understanding more. It cries out for leaders to be more curious and notice more. And in my view, the book offers those of us that lead a wealth of insights and, crucially, some actionable knowledge. The other strong thing about the book is the efforts that our authors make to interrogate the experience of many leaders in different organizational contexts. The book's grounded in careful and thoughtful research and analysis, and I congratulate you all on it being so well researched and analysed and offering so many thoughtful insights. So with that opening remarks, and so thank you very much for writing it, is my first point, but let me introduce our speakers now. In no particular order, we've got Tracey Camilleri, former director of the Oxford Strategic Leadership Programme, which, as many of you will know, is our flagship programme at the Business School in Leadership. She's co-founder of the Leadership and Organisational Development Consultancy, Thompson Harrison. She's an associate fellow of the Saïd Business School and is well-renowned and skilled in her leadership design programme work more generally. So welcome, Tracey. And followed very quickly by Sam Rockey, also the co-founder of Thompson Harrison, also an associate fellow of the Saïd Business School, and works on the Strategic Leadership Programme as well. And like Tracey, has a passion for designing and delivering stretching leadership development programs and a wealth of knowledge in that respect as well. And then finally, Robin Dunbar, Emeritus Professor of Evolutionary Psychology at the University of Oxford, an incredibly well-respected academic who has done outstanding research on human connection and social dynamics. And we look forward to hearing from all of you about the book. I know we're going to have a presentation now, and Tracey, you're going to kick us off. Let me remind our audience, though, if you've got, there is a chance to ask questions as we go along. So do feel free to put your questions in the question and answer box. And I promise that we will get to those during the presentation, after the presentation rather. Tracey, over to you.
Thanks so much, Sue. It's great to be here, and thank you all for joining as well. I know some of you are alumni from the Oxford Strategic Leadership Programme. What we're going to do over the next 45 or so minutes is I'm going to talk a little bit up front about why we think the book is important now. Why did we write it? Robin's going to talk a bit more about the science behind the book and his lifetime of research. And as Sue says, what doesn't change about human behavior. And Sam's going to talk a bit about the practice. How do you put some of this into practice and draw on some of the examples and cases that we highlight in the book. Just a little bit about us. Sue's very kindly introduced us. I met Sam and Robin about 10 years ago, and what struck me at the time was all three of us were grappling with a similar question, which is, why do some groups come together and actually end up as more than the sum of their parts? And why do some groups, clever, capable, actually bring one another down? And all three of us were wrestling with this question from sort of different perspectives. Sam had been the head of leadership in a large global organization, and really thinking about the dynamics of big businesses, about the politics and the pushes and the pulls. Robin had been, as I say, looking at our underlying psychology and biology about what doesn't change. And I'd been, with Sue in the business school, designing and directing leadership programs. And I suppose my laboratory, if I just tell my own story, my laboratory was, sort of around a week, bringing together some friendly strangers, people who were often exhausted from overwork and sometimes jet lag, people who had extraordinary mastery in lots of different ways. They felt the digital pull of, what was going on in the office while they were spending a week in Oxford. And so my big challenge was, how do you create a sense of high curiosity for those people? How do you create a sense of the tribe, of connection? How do you create trust and fast track that? And how can you do something in 5 days that isn't just something that was nice to have, but had real impact beyond? And over the years, started to think, and this is something that Sam and I do as well in our programs, think about how we could work as social designers, if you will. And we began to learn what works and what doesn't. Those of you who've been on the program, on the first day, that the cultural museum that we did, actually getting people to tell stories about themselves to strangers very early on, really brought people together, thinking really, really analytically about meals. So we'd always begin with a curry or a family size sharing meal where people had to pass things around. And Robin would say that the spice in a curry actually creates more endorphins, which are the social hormones that bring us together. Those of you who are on the strategic leadership program will remember that little lip of fear when you work with Peter Hanker in the chapel, and actually shared, acute fear is not good, but a little bit of fear of going out of a comfort zone, sharing an experience together is hugely bonding. Or actually, some of you will remember having to produce a poem as well. That again is a fearsome act for some people. And the experiential nature of working, together, walking in the park, synchrony again is another hugely important bonder. So we started to really play with those kinds of things and act as social designers. How do you put together a successful tutor group, for example? And we also played with scale. There was one time, a couple of times actually, that we thought, well, why not make, this is all great, we're enjoying it, why not make the group bigger? And we were really fascinated by the fact that the group split into two. And we wondered, is there, we've only changed the numbers by about 4 or 5. What's going on here? And those sorts of questions led the three of us to come together and write this book. Wasn't just us though. We spent a lot of time interviewing wonderful leaders around the world, leading in all sorts of different areas, so that we could incorporate their stories, their practice, their examples into the book. We didn't want to write a theoretical tome that no one picked up. So the first face you see there, Ramatu, actually had been on the strategic leadership program, and she had the difficult job of leading a supply chain in the biggest state in Nigeria during a pandemic. And the stresses of leading that team under that kind of pressure were hugely enlightening for us, what she did. There's a surgeon there who leads a very tight team under extreme pressure. How do you reach out for an instrument and know that the person handing it to you will hand you the right thing? How do you get that sense of trust in a team? Owen Eastwood there, who is the cultural coach for many sports teams and really thinks about culture and how you create a sense of belonging and inclusion. We talked with Clara, who's a designer, about creativity and how you foster and help creativity in teams. And a vast number, we've got CEOs in there, conductors, some faces may be familiar to some of you. Klaus there, who talks about the importance of playfulness, of playing together, of laughing together and sharing a sense of humor. And with activists, Yog in there, an entrepreneur, who talked about, as her business grew, that sense of absolute exhaustion of holding it all in mind and holding an increasing number of relationships in mind, and what she did about it. I could go through them all. There's Tyrone Urch, who's a general in the army, and he talks about how the small pivotal fire teams of only 5 people, and how sharing exposure, sharing fear together meant that they were so tight and trust was so high in those teams, and gave us several examples of that. So we bring these stories into the book. So why write it now? We also thought it was a very interesting moment, and a difficult moment in many ways, a moment where people were rethinking the structures and rhythms of work. And that slide is supposed to represent a screen. And many of us, even though we use the phrase post-pandemic, many of us are still working in a hybrid way. And goodness, how magical is it? I mean, here we all are, and you are around the world listening to this. There's something absolutely magical about us being able to connect virtually. But many of you will be familiar with studies, for example, like the Microsoft Trends Index, that showed how prolonged period of time connecting virtually actually narrows our networks and dilutes our relationships. We are profoundly relational beings. We need human relationship. We need that analog face-to-face world. And without it, we actually suffer. So the challenge, we believe, for leadership right now is to get the best of both worlds. And certainly some of our clients are, stamping their feet and thinking, get back in the office now, everybody, that's the rule. Some are thinking, actually, the flexibility of the hybrid world is brilliant for some people, and we need to think about how we can have a coherent design. We were speaking to one management consultant the other day who said, we're having drinks every Friday night to try and get the young people back into the office, but they just turn up for the drinks, not for the Fridays. So this, how do we earn the commute? How do we actually adapt our offices to be places as well that people want to come to? And crucially, when we do bring people together in person, how do we make it matter? How do we make it count? How do we make it not that everyone's in the office, but they're still all on screens because some people are in, some people are out? How do we actually create environments where trust, discretionary effort, social capital, and crucially, and Robin will go on to talk about this, crucially, friendship can happen, because those are incredibly important for successful businesses, and in fact any team, whether you're in government, whether you're leading a sports team, all those things are important. So we examine those questions in our book. Right at the end of the book, we interviewed the great historian Theodore Zeldin, who wrote History of the French People and so on, and he said to us, well, what are you doing? I mean, what is the point of business? And he said, can we not have more experiments to offer something better to young people? And isn't that the ultimate purpose of organizations? And we really thought about that. And we thought about this moment, either we go back to what we were doing before COVID, which frankly didn't work, or we see this moment as a moment to reimagine and to redesign the way we work and the structure of the way in which we work. And I like that word, experiments. How can we offer sustained experiments to young people? At Thompson Harrison, we've recently been doing some work, some research around Gen Z, and particularly the first year of work, those young people who are coming into the world of work now. And, it's a really mixed picture, but it's definitely a picture that requires leaders to be thinking more deeply about the experience of young people than perhaps they have. Some people talk about quiet quitting, that they're just sort of silently giving up a little behind their screens. One young man said to us, well, nobody comes in on a Friday, but I do, because the finance director is in on a Friday, and he comes every Friday and he just asks me, how's my week been? And he said that just makes all the difference. I spoke recently to the MBAs at the business school, and one young man said, gosh, there was a huge amount of care and precision and attention in hiring me. And I was really, really impressed. And once I'd been hired, this was his job before he started the MBA, he said, I just felt I was abandoned. I didn't know what I'd been hired into. I didn't have a sense of belonging or sustained connection. And so this is another thing we look at in our book is, how can we think about sustained experiments that offer something better? And the other thing to think about is not only performance and environments for innovation, environments for impact, but also, the epidemic of loneliness and mental health. Some of you may have seen the recent study by Sapiens Lab that came out, I think, last week. It's a study of almost 500,000 people over 64 countries. And one shocking thing that came out was that if you're aged 18 to 24, you are 5 times more likely than your grandparents' generation to suffer from some kind of mental health issue. And we went back and looked at the definition of well-being by the World Health Organization back in the 50s, and it is a state of complete physical, mental, and social health. And one of the things all three of us felt was that there's been a huge attention to physical and mental health. I think $50 billion it is spent per year on well-being in organizations, from apps and bots and yoga and all kinds of things that are very good, but focused at individuals. But the focus on social health has been lacking, the social relational health. And Robin will say, if you want to give up smoking, find a friend who doesn't smoke. It's the best way to do it. And, our friends and the number of friends we have are the best indicators of our future physical health and as well as mental health. So there's another side to our book, which is looking at this as being a moment to think more broadly and more socially and more relationally about well-being. And just finally, as this ends my bit, by the way, if you're getting sick of my voice, but just to think that this is a moment as well where people are thinking about the shape of their organizations. We're really fascinated by how some big companies are thinking about that sort of traditional pyramidal shape that we have in the back of our minds, that are somehow echoed by our org charts, feels brittle. It feels like it doesn't work in a complex system, which is where we all work, where change comes from the bottom, it comes from the edge. Love this line by Van Gogh: life is probably round, and yet we are all round pegs working in square holes or pyramidal holes or whatever. And in our book, we explore different ways of thinking about the shapes of organization, fractals, honeycombs, lattices, more relational, more agile, more able to adapt, less brittle, more human in the end. And so that leads me to hand over to Robin to talk a little bit more about the science behind what we've written about.
Okay, thank you, Tracey. So I'm going to really put in place, I guess, something of the science that sits behind this book. I'd been working on the evolution of societies in monkeys and apes originally, and then perhaps the last 20, 25 years, the equivalent in humans. And I'd begun to think that, well, a lot of this stuff that we're seeing in everyday life as how we live, as it were, as social beings, must have implications for the world of business, because the world of business, at the end of the day, is a social world. It requires people to talk to each other and engage with each other and do things together. And how well they do that, in a way it seems obvious, must go better and be more efficient if they actually function as a village, if you like, or as a tribe, and have genuine, friendly relationships. So this is a consequence in many ways of our evolutionary history of the species. Here, there's a sort of notional brain, if you like, pointing to various bits that are important in the context of this story. Part the need to be in groups. We are intensely social as a species, and of course, at least until lockdown, we probably spent more than half our week, waking hours of the week, at work, rather than in any other context. So it's a natural place in which some of our social friends, part of our social network, is going to be in that context. So it's a sort of, the world of work is not a world of strangers by any means. So there's that natural requirement, as it were, to be in a social environment, and one that works smoothly. Part of that is a reflection of the size of key bits of our brain, the neocortex in particular, but also the way the brain manages social relationships in particular, the hormonal underpinnings of that. A lot of that is about bonding, and bonding is very time consuming, involves a lot of hard work on our part, but time is limited in the day, and although a lot of our social time, or a lot of our time is devoted to the social world, we have to think very carefully about how we allocate it. So all these things come together in terms of influencing both what is an ideal group to be in, but also how well we work within it. Okay, Sam. So the core to this really is what's become known as Dunbar's number, which is, for a very quick definition, simply the number of relationships, meaningful relationships, that you can have at any one time. This doesn't mean all the people you know by sight by any means. This is people that you have real meaningful relationships, and those relationships that have history. You've known them for at least some period of time. You have some sense of how they tick, if you like, and why you would want to include them in your network of friends and family. The limit on that seems to be about 150 people. We have lots and lots of data now from all sorts of different sources, both looking at individual people's social networks, their extended social networks, but also looking at that, if you like, is looking bottom up from your position in the world to the people around you, but also looking top down from above at the size of natural organizations. So things like hunter-gatherer community sizes, the size of church congregations, the sizes of business congregations, the sizes of military units. All these things keep producing this figure of about 150, give or take a bit around that. So something odd about this number that seems to, if you like, make the world go round effectively and efficiently. Now, in the normal course of everyday life, about half of that 150 would be taken up with extended family members, perhaps running out to second or even third cousins, maybe. And about half of those would be true friends in the conventional sense of friendships. But managing that number really depends on, if you like, the time invested in it, such that there's quite a high rate of turnover. There's a natural process of turnover that goes on in the course of our everyday lives, in terms of who we are friends with, and even this extends to family members. We fall out of favor with some, and we fall into favor with others. To put some numbers around that, the movement in the friendship circles of 18 to 25-year-olds is very high indeed. About 40% of their network members change position every year. So it's a terribly dynamic process. It is much slower from about the 30s onwards. It stabilizes really quite considerably. But you know, it is a fluid and a dynamic process as our needs and wants and interests change. Okay, next please, Sam. So if you look at this figure of 150, it's actually consists of, it turns out, and we didn't know this, and when we started working on these kind of things, consists of a series of circles. So your social world looks a bit like the diagram on the right there. You are ego in the center, the Latin for I or me, and you are surrounded by these layers of relationships, and these layers of relationships have very, very specific sizes. So there's an inner layer of 1.5, which is the average number of intimate relationships you have, roughly, and then there's a layer at 5, a layer at 15, 50, and you get out to the 150. And then, as we now know, these numbers continue up beyond that. There's a layer at 500, 1500, and the outermost layer is at 5,000, which is actually differentiates between people you've actually seen before, even if it's only a photograph, and complete strangers. So the total number of pictures of faces you can have in your mind at any one time is about 5,000. Beyond that, it's completely anonymous. So the inner core layers, though, from the 150 down to, let's say, the 5, essentially play different roles in our lives. So the inner core 5 of what we sometimes call the support clique, or the shoulders to cry on friends. They're the people who will drop everything to come and pick you up when your world falls apart, and they're very important in our lives. And in fact, it's that particular circle of relationships, friendships, that has a huge effect on our mental and physical health and well-being, as Tracey mentioned earlier. The single best predictor of your health and well-being, both psychologically and physically, is the number and quality of those close friendships that you have. And there's an optimum at about 5. And this raises, in this context, quite an important and serious point, I think, for business organizations, in the sense that if people don't have that layer, whether it be at work or at home, then their susceptibility to depression and other ill states ill mental states, and indeed their susceptibility to the kinds of everyday diseases which healthy people would just shrug off, to quite serious diseases is greatly increased, dramatically so. And that means time off work, or if they're not off work, they're working at half measure. So there are real meaningful consequences for organizations, I think, in if you like, not catering to these needs that we all have. Okay, next, please. Now, I mentioned earlier, and Tracey mentioned earlier, that these relationships are very costly in terms of the time you have to invest in them. Your brain, as it were, your neocortex, is working very hard to kind of manage them, but you don't have any of these relationships at all if you don't invest time. And indeed, the layering structure that you get is actually directly a consequence of the amount of time that we invest in the individuals in our social network. And we pick this up not only in face-to-face diary type data of real life interactions, but we pick it up in phone call data sets, we pick it up in Facebook posting data sets, and with exactly the same frequencies. So each of those layers corresponds to a very specific frequency of interaction. The inner core of 5 people, you see each of them on average about at least once a week. And that has to be kept up. You obviously have to start off building the relationship, but that frequency of interaction has to be kept up. As a result of that, 40% of our total social time, and that's something like 3 hours a day, is devoted to those 5 people in the center. They get a lot of our attention. Another 20% is devoted to the 15 people outside that. So that this 60% figure here comes from those 2 layers. 15 people are getting 60% of your attention and your mental and time effort invested in building bonds with them. So the actual process of building bonds then is both very time consuming, but absolutely crucial to maintaining the efficiency and effectiveness of those relationships. Okay, next, please. And this brings me around then to the processes that are involved in bonding. This comes in 2 separate levels that kind of work in tandem with each other in the brain, as when they're using 2 different parts of the brain. The basic underpinnings of friendship and close relationships in all monkeys and apes and in humans is the endorphin system in the brain. A lot of the things we do trigger the endorphin system and activate it. And the more it's activated, the stronger of a relationship it creates. Because what it does is create a sense of calmness and trust and warmth and all's well with the world with the person you engage in these activities. And what we use in everyday life, in addition to the kind of what's now called soft touch, social touch, sort of caresses and pats on the shoulder and hugs and these kind of things that we all do, which is essentially the primate way of doing this. In the course of our evolution of species, we've added on to that other ways which allow us to trigger the same endorphin system in the brain, which incidentally is part of the pain management system of the brain, which is perhaps why it works the way it does and produces the sensations it does. But what we found is other ways of triggering that system without actually physically having to touch somebody, and therefore we can do it with many people simultaneously because touch is so intimate, it limits how many people you can do it with. And those things are essentially laughter, singing, dancing, the rituals of religion, feasting, eating and drinking socially as a group, and lastly, storytelling. It turns out that telling happy stories or tragic stories trigger the endorphin system in the brain because we feel psychological pain, as in hearing about some tragedy, some drama, as it were, in exactly the same places in the brain as we feel physical pain. So it kicks in the endorphin system. So those become very important in building relationships. And the reason we have those is primarily to sort of build out beyond the limits of 150 and allow us to create mega communities out beyond to 500, 1500, and so on. And indeed, they are exploited in real everyday life to build mega communities of the kind we have with nation states and so on. The other half of the story is stuff that's going on in the brain. These are what we call the 7 pillars of friendship. There is essentially a kind of supermarket barcode you have, except instead of being stamped on your forehead, you actually speak them. And this is because they're cultural, they identify who you are as a person and the kind of community you come from, the kind of things you like and don't like. And these we're very sensitive to and pick up on very, very quickly. And there are things like dialect. If you hear somebody's dialect, immediately you know where they come from. And that's to say, if they're from your own town or village, you've got a bond already with them. You've trod the same streets as they have, you've drunk in the same pubs as they have, even if you might not have done it at the same time. It's a point of connection there. And then the other things are things like career trajectory, your moral and political and religious views, your worldview, if you like, your hobbies and interests. And the two interesting ones, which always surprise everybody, and they surprised us originally when we first came across them, is your musical taste and your sense of humor. And these turn out to be very, very good bases for creating friendships with strangers. If you share the same musical interests or share the same sense of humor, it allows you to form very quickly friendships with strangers. Okay, so I think that takes me to the end of my time, and it's over to Sam.
Thank you so much. So one of the challenges of the book was how to integrate the science, the art, the conversations that we had with the people that Tracey mentioned right at the beginning, and put it into something really pragmatic for leaders to use back in their organizations. And I'm going to take you through 3 ideas. Our book has many more, but for today, and I know that many of you are in leadership roles, is what could you use from our book that would be really helpful as you go back into the workplace. So I'm going to touch on 3 things. The first is a model we've called the Thrive model. The second is around thinking about a social strategy, and then how do you match team size to team task? What might that look like in very pragmatic ways? So I'd like to begin with the Thrive model. As Robin has alluded to, work is nothing more than a collection of social groupings, and then applying the principles of what really makes humans thrive. What are the things that get us out of our beds in the morning and go off into work, either to our desk and to our Zoom or actually into a workplace? How can we feel motivated? How can we feel that we really want to contribute to the direction of the organization? So we've pulled together 6 key themes that are absolutely consistent across all humans operating in groups. And of course, if you're working in a small group of 5 people, as Robin was saying, these things would occur naturally, actually. So you would feel a sense of connection, you'd feel seen by the other members of your small group. You have to work less hard at creating the conditions for thriving. They exist. So our model looks at how do you amplify across great numbers of people? How do you amplify across scale? And we looked at sort of 6 areas. The first is really around connecting. So as Robin said, what are the ways that we release endorphins, a sense of well-being with our fellow human? How can you put that in the workplace? How can you create a sense of belonging? For us, we really feel that belonging is one of those things that when you have it, it's something that really encourages you to participate and bring your full self into a group, into the workplace. And there's been a lot that's been written on belonging. Owen Eastwood talks a lot about it. He's spoken on the OSLP in the past, actually. What are the small gestures of belonging? How do you make sure that everybody in the group feels a sense of shared values? These could be unwritten rules, these could be principles, but what are the things that everybody has in common, really? And we know that when groups share values, there is a greater sense of connection and commitment to, in a sense, a shared future. And that brings us to purpose. For as long as humans have been operating in small groups together, they've always felt a need to connect to something that's much bigger than themselves. And we see this kind of idea of articulated purpose as being a really important part of group thriving. And it also means people are purposeful. So what is the contribution you make towards the organization that you're part of? Culture, the consistency of culture. Tracey speaks so beautifully of what's of the culture of the OSLP, which is sort of started right from the minute people join to when they leave and ongoing. Actually, I know that many people on this webinar have been on the OSLP. You'll have felt a sense of what those consistent behaviors and practices are, and being a contributor to the culture as well. Every new person who comes on the program contributes to the future sense of the program's culture. And then finally, learning. We are hardwired to learn, actually. In our diagram of the brain, you would have seen that one of our human gifts is learning from each other. There's nothing more powerful than learning from your peers, learning from other people's shared experiences, hearing a story, actually, that we can all sit back and think, gosh, I've been in a similar situation, is incredibly empowering. So our Thrive model, we talk a lot about it in our book, but how can it be used back in your organization to really contribute to performance, innovation, and impact? And we use examples from organizations that have thrived over many years, decades even, in some cases centuries, actually, because they've applied some of these absolutely fundamental principles to the way that they do business, reeling all the way back to the fact that we are social animals who really enjoy being part of social groups. The second piece that I think is our contribution to the conversation about team performance, actually. We've done a lot of work in team performance over many years, but one of the things that is often not really pulled on is how teams are designed in terms of task and team size. So thinking about how you design your team to optimally deliver a task, I think, is one of the real kind of new ways of thinking about how you think about your team. And I'm just going to draw on one very small example. Let's take a group of 5. Fives are incredibly effective at fast decision making. We were working with a client yesterday who spoke about the fact that there are so many people who come to every single team meeting and end up having only 2 or 3 people talk in the meeting and contribute to decision. I mean, the amount of wasted time, the loss of productivity, the sense of not being part of something is enormous. How could you be much more deliberate about designing every single one of your team meetings, your team structures, to really match the task that needs to be done? And what Robin hasn't spoken about today, but we do talk about in the book, is it's so difficult to break up with people. It's not an easy thing, but sometimes you have to break up with people to get the right team configuration. And it's difficult. So how can one do that? Breaking up is hard to do, especially in the workplace. And then the third area that I want to touch on is this idea of a social strategy. We can't leave these things to chance. Tracey spoke about what the World Health Organization describes as sense of kind of human thriving as being physical, mental, but of course it's also social. And friendship doesn't happen just by chance. We spend a lot of time at work. We spend a lot of time with people at work. We are great fans of friendship. We know that friendship at work contributes to performance. We have some fantastic case studies in our book about how that works, but you have to make the time to build friendships. It takes about 200 hours to make a new friend. So in a sense, for workplaces to be places where friendships can thrive, where real connection can thrive, where people can feel seen, organizations need to really think about that in a strategic way, much as they would do about finance strategy or marketing strategy. Something as simple as bringing people together over lunch in a canteen. I worked for a global FTSE top 10 company for many years. No matter where you were in the world, and we had offices and manufacturing sites all over the world, is there would always be a canteen, an opportunity for people to come together over lunch and share a meal. It's often the first thing to go, but honestly, the benefits of having a place of communal eating, I think, can't be overstated. And then finally, it's cognitively hard work to spend time in relationship, to be focusing on relationship. It's exhausting, actually, sometimes. Sometimes you just think, let me just get back to my task. Some of you might even be doing this on this call. But so actually, it's not the soft and fluffy stuff. It's the difficult stuff. It's the demanding stuff, but it's the important and powerful stuff. And our book, as Sue said right at the beginning, is really well researched around why making time to think about a social strategy, making time to think about creating these opportunities for connection is the way that humans thrive and organizations thrive. I'm going to ask Tracey to do a quick sum up. Heard.
Thank you. Yes, I'm conscious of time, and please do put any questions. We'd love them in the box if you've got any for us. Nothing comes for free in biology. We said at the beginning, you have to work with and against the grain of our biology and our psychology. And not everything about being human is good. We will free ride given half the chance if we don't feel we're being observed. And as Robin said, that 150 is the point at which reciprocity and obligation shifts into the more transactional. So if you're part of a very, very big organization, it's easier to free ride in a way. And thinking about that, we are homophilic to some extent. We are attracted by people who share our pillars of friendship. And there is time, many of you listening to the call are leaders, where we need to disrupt that homophily, to bring in difference in order to make better decisions and to have more diverse groups. All like organizations are clusters of social groupings. Quite often we hide behind the idea that the organization won't allow us to do this, or it's not what we do here. It's just us in the end, and we can, in this moment of redesign, of rethink, of reimagine, actually do more interesting, more human and more productive things. Remember our gifts, our constraints and our constants. Quite often organizations inadvertently interfere with our gifts, interfere with our propensity and our capacity to think about the future, to imagine, to do all kinds of things that machines can't do. And yet we also ignore our constraints. We behave as if time is totally unbounded, and as if we can have as many friends as grains of sand on the beach. We are constrained. We do have gifts, and there are things that are constant. And one of those is that need to be known and to know. Sam talked about the 6 foundational conditions to thriving teams. We noticed in our research that the best and most thriving teams actually held those in a kind of balance. And the leaders were focused on creating environments rather than coming up with policies, answers, solutions. The practice of leadership alters as scale alters. Probably don't have time to say much about that. That was fascinating for us, how leadership practice changes as scale changes. And we deal with that in our book, or on LinkedIn. I just actually did a little tiny film about that if anyone's interested. Sam's talked about team size and task, and finally this need for a social strategy with the same kind of rigor, the same kind of application that we spend hours and hours and hours in C-suites thinking about financial strategy, marketing strategy, digital strategy. This is the moment to bring the same kind of rigor And the same kind of focus and attention to having a social strategy in order that the organizations and the teams that we lead can thrive.
Okay, thank you very much to our presenters there for that very elegant summary of the book. We've got some questions. Robin, I'm conscious you've got to leave us at some point to do another lecture. So can I ask you the first question, if I may? And it's from Keith Herman. How can new young employees and organizations build a sense of belonging when they're a stranger looking in, when they're not part of the organization, given their lack of social networks? Over to you, Robin.
Well, I actually think this is probably one of the biggest issues of the day in many ways, much bigger than lockdown or anything like that, because it's been going on longer. At least the last 2 decades, there's been this pandemic of loneliness in new young starters, mainly because they're moving away from home and university environments where they've had a ready-made social world there on the plate for them, and going to a city where they don't know anybody, they don't know where to go to meet people that's safe and suitable. And the only people they know are the people at work, who obviously already have well-established networks and homes to rush back to at 5 o'clock. So, you end up with a lot of people who have become very dispirited, I guess, and very disillusioned, and of course then become susceptible to depression and physical diseases in the way I mentioned earlier. So the problem is, how do you engage them? And I think that is probably something that needs to be given a lot of attention, but it's about creating the kinds of environments in the workplace that allow people to engage socially with each other and to speed. Well, if you wait long enough, they will eventually bed in and form friendships. But what you want to do is to find ways of speeding that up. And there are people have done engaging kinds of things like that. I might mention 2 very, very quickly, and they both come from Sam, actually. So I probably ought to let her tell these stories rather than me. But one is singing. A lot of hospitals and similar kinds of organizations have set up choirs and have found them very, very beneficial in creating a sense of bonding and belonging and commitment in the people that attend. And this is what Sam provided us with a very nice example of that in her earlier life, as it were. Singing is a great bonder. We always refer to it as the icebreaker effect, because you can turn complete strangers into lifelong friends who've known each other since kindergarten, just with an hour's community singing. And I don't mean, sort of Bach cantatas and the like. I just mean Gareth Malone round the campfire community singing. It's absolutely magical. And the other is what SAB Miller did when Sam worked for them. They had a bar, a pub, literally, in the foyer of all the factories and campus buildings, where people would just gather casually to have a quick beer before the end of work before they go home. And those kind of casual opportunities to meet people and get to know other people from other departments breaks enormous ice. And I think if I quote Sam correctly here, but she correct me if I'm wrong, is some of the Facebook groups that were set up out of those social environments at SAB Miller 2 decades down the line are still going, and the people in them work now in different parts of the world for different companies. So there are things you can do. What we have to do is to sit down and look very carefully at what will work in the contemporary modern world, where people obviously have outside interests to go to as well. So try and find something that will work in the context of your particular organization. But I don't know if Sam wants to add to that. She's the expert on this.
No, I think well described, Robert.
Okay, great. Let me have another question then. I think before you go, Robin, this is probably one for you. Which resources would you recommend to get a deeper insight about the neurophysiology about group dynamics? I think that's just can I read some more, please? And then we'll move on to the next question. If you can answer that before I know you have to go.
Okay. So they want to know how this stuff works. Is that the question?
Yeah, which resources? Yeah, something to read, I think, and then we can
I can only recommend my immediately preceding book, which is just called Friends, the understanding the power of our most important relationships, and it's all in there.
There you go. Thank you. So Frederick, very good for that. I know you've got to go, Robin.
Right.
Let me ask another question for Peter Sear. Do you think human beings are not designed for large corporations? Is it that the bigger the corporation, the worse we treat each other and customers? So interesting question here from Peter. Thank you, Peter.
Shall I begin? And then, so Peter, yeah, it's a good, we really looked hard at that. And it's what we mentioned before, that at around 150, it's this moment where people say it's that beyond 150 where the weird stuff happens. It's the stand on a chair number. And it's the number at which, you know, obligation, reciprocity, relationship, if you will, tips over into the more transactional. Now, does this mean that you can't thrive in large organizations? Absolutely not. But there is something about the conceptual way that we think about how they are organized, and that need within those big organizations to have smaller units, of identity and connection. And I think that's what I was trying to get at when I talked about sort of fractals and lattices and honeycombs, that sense that, yes, we're contained within a huge organization with a similar kind of purpose and set of values and principles, tight principles, loose rules often. There's devolved and distributed leadership, but there is a sense of belonging that comes from being held in mind and being known. I mean, I think large corporations often anonymize people within them. You know, they are human resources, and there's a necessity to it sometimes, but there does need to be smaller units of identity.
Thank you. Sam, do you want to add?
Yeah, just one quick thing. In our Thrive model, we talk about values, and that partly comes from the organizations that we looked at in our book, and two that spring to mind is Gore and Mars, both huge organizations, but what they have running through them is a strong kind of sense of values and principles that have come from, in a sense, their founders. And these are almost a century old, both of them. So there is something about very large organizations having, as Tracey says, a kind of holding idea to them. But one of those seems to be this kind of sense of a collective coming together around principles that have been in place for a very long time for those older organizations, and certainly a recommendation for startups. And Tracey's spoken recently to a group of small business owners, is, you know, what are those core principles that you'd want to put in place that can get replicated as you scale up?
Great. Okay, I think we've got time for a couple more questions. David Grossi here talks about, as well as the positive power of close teams, are there downsides to be aware and managed of in groups, out groups? So close teams and groupthink. Any comments on that?
Absolutely. It's a great question. And, you know, as we said, nothing comes for free. The fact is, we've been very interested in the edges of all this. And of course, belonging, it's kind of a no-brainer. We need to feel we belong. But extreme cultish, inward-looking, groupthink, exclusionary behavior is destructive. And it's the same with everything. You know, if I only work with a group of friends, I don't want to work with anyone else. It's destructive. And I think that's where, you know, leadership comes in, leadership working with and against the grain, sometimes ruffling our complacency, sometimes disturbing natural clusters. All the time, you know, it's a moving in, standing back. But you're absolutely right. There is a downside to all of this in excess, but it is a moment, we believe, where actually we need more of it rather than less.
Okay, great. Thank you. Let me just ask the last question. Sam, maybe you can take this one from Max. Really insightful. How do we encourage our teams to keep the balance between a high-paced world with stretched targets and the need to develop social relationships? If we could have a 30-second answer on that. Sam, no pressure.
Oh, sure. Well, I think in a way, our view would be that begin with the connection, begin with the things that create the thriving environment, begin with the sense of people feeling like they belong to something. And then the high-pressured, high-performing environment follows. So if we start with creating environments for thriving, the benefit is huge. So perhaps flip it and spend more time on the social strategy. And yeah, the tasks might take care of themselves. Well, certainly in our book, we talk a lot about the power of incidental learning and innovation that comes from those moments where you're not focused on the task, but you're just connecting. I don't know if that answered the question in 30 seconds.
There you go. Well, that's all we've got time for, I think. We have come to the end of our time. Let me thank you all for sharing with us this exciting adventure and this new book, and also thank you, of course, who've actually been our audience today. And it's just wonderful, isn't it, to see how the Strategic Leadership Program, a program that we all love, and we see people transformed on that journey, how actually that group of people and beyond, the other leaders that we all work with, are now shaping, the kind of work that you've just been sharing with us. So it's a wonderful win-win situation. But thank you, Tracey, Sam, and Robin, wherever he's gone to, for a wonderful sort of a seminar. And thank you all very much for joining. Take care, all.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for joining.
Yeah, thanks for joining. Take care.
Bye-bye.